Hi everyone, and thanks for joining the Talking Animals Law and Philosophy series. My name is Eva Bernard Kempers and I'm a Junior Research Associate at the Cambridge Center for Animal Rights Law. For those of you who are attending the Talking Animals series for the first time, just a quick note on the format. First we'll start with around a 40-minute presentation, and then we'll have around a 40 minutes for Q&A and discussion. The event will eventually end around 6:30 p.m. UK time. You're all warmly invited to participate in the discussion following the lecture. In case you would like to ask a question or make a comment, you can use the Q&A function. I will then go through the questions in the discussion section. You can also upvote those questions that you would like to be asked. We will be recording the presentation part of this event, but not the Q&A part. We will later be uploading the video to our website. It is now my pleasure to introduce our speaker of today, Matthew Wray Perry. Matthew is a postdoctoral research fellow in ethics and political and social philosophy at the University of British Columbia. He completed his PhD in 2023 at the Manchester Center for Political Theory, where his research focused on the Foundation for Animal Rights and Dignity. His current work explores the ethics of human-animal relationships, with a particular attention to social status. He has published several articles on moral status and dignity and is currently working on a book project that argues for rethinking familiar ideas from debates over human rights and dignity to include non-human animals. Matthew, thanks a lot for being here today with us. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Eva, and thanks also to the Centre for the really kind invitation. I've listened to the talks in this series for quite some time, and it's a real honor to have the chance to present in them. So I'll just share my screen. Okay, so yeah, as a way of some background, Ava already mentioned my work's focused on dignity for quite some time, and I've attempted to dip my toes into other areas now and then, but it's a concept that I keep coming back to. So hopefully over the course of the next 30 to 40 minutes or so, you'll start to see why that is, why it's kind of gripping my attention so much. So the talk is based on a paper which I recently had accepted in Politics, Philosophy, and Economics, where I tried to lay out the grounds for dignity. And I kind of see it as crystallizing a lot of the arguments that I made in my thesis a couple of years back. What I'm going to do today, I will give a bit of a definition of how I understand dignity in a moment, but that will become clearer as the talk goes on. To start with, I'll just give a brief overview of what I'm going to say. So I'll begin with like a brief overview of some of the literature and how I kind of see how we ought to understand that literature and where exactly what I'm saying is kind of placed within that and stuff. And then I'm going to talk about this challenge of exclusion. So many of you will be familiar with the idea that normative theory, law, ethics, politics in general is kind of exclusionary when it comes to animals. But I think this worry has a particular force when it comes to dignity. So I'll say a bit about why and what our options are in responding to that. But the option I endorse is that we should, rather than abandoning dignity, completely rethink it, or well, not entirely rethink it, but think about a new basis for it in sentience instead, the capacity for subjective experiences. And rather than giving some really abstract arguments for why I think sentience is a good basis to do with the value of sentience or something, even though I think those exist, I'm not going to focus on them. Instead, I'm going to talk about three practical virtues that I think that this approach would have, okay? And then I'm going to respond to the dignity skeptics in two ways, by talking about the philosophical value that I see that dignity has, and also the strategic value, so the value that it might have in law, in politics, in everyday life. And then I'll finish as a way of kind of conclusion, by saying a little bit about how I see that this approach might help to lead us towards a more well-grounded foundation for multi-species justice. So I'll just say a little bit about that, and if you have any thoughts or questions about or ideas to help develop that, then I'd be really keen to hear them. Okay, so first up, what is dignity? So there's been a bunch of recent literature focusing on the concept of animal dignity. I'm not going to go over everything that's here, but if you're intrigued by it, then do take a screenshot or come back to it. A lot of this stuff is referenced in the paper I mentioned in PPE. The problem, though, that I see with a lot of this literature is, even though it's helpful, and I'm not disputing much of it, what I want to say kind of complements a lot of what has already been said. The problem is that I don't think the grounds for dignity has received a proper, or for animal dignity in particular, has received a proper justification yet. So there's been a few attempts by Pablo Gilabert, Martha Nussbaum, and Michael Mayer, but I think that these approaches aren't quite these approaches aren't quite up to the task just yet. So I think there's a few problems that they face. And what I want to propose is an account that has a more stable and robust basis in sentience. So before I get into that, dignity is kind of understood in many, many different ways. But at its core, I think dignity is a particular kind of status. So it's a status that some being possesses. And we can divide understandings of that status into two camps, I think. And some of Raphael Feisal's work has been helpful to me in approaching this kind of understanding of the literature in this way. So the first camp is what we might call like naturalistic attempts to understand dignity. And they perceive dignity to be this kind of status of inherent value that a being has in virtue of some natural property that they possess. And that natural property grants them natural rights and means that they ought to be treated with respect. And so that's the kind of dignity that I'm going to be talking about for most of the next 30 minutes or so. The alternative account is this kind of conventionalist understanding of dignity, which tries to, rather than building dignity up from some kind of foundation, it tries to construct an understanding of dignity that is coherent. And so the idea here is that rather than dignity being this kind of inherent value that is held within the individual, it's instead the kind of value that you're perceived to have by the community. So ideas of rank and social status are really important here. So you think of the traditional concept of dignity as some kind of as dignitas, the dignitas of a king or a queen or something. So thinkers like Waldron want to say that we should extend this notion of dignity to the whole human community, so everybody can stand tall like a king. And the idea here is that once you have that perceived high social status, you then have rights as this kind of convention that we put in place to protect that status in some way. And so the claim that I want to make focuses on this left side of the picture, but I will come later on to the conventionalist understanding when I begin to say something about how I think dignity is forming a more a wider basis for multi-species justice. And the specific claim that I'm going to make is that that status ought to be grounded in sentience and sentience alone, and no other property. And I think that from that, we end up with a robust account of sentient rights that can be enshrined in law, used in politics, and as a guide for ethical treatment of animals. So that's what I'm going to say. So the challenge of exclusion, obviously this has been made by many animal ethicists before, including Peter Singer with his animal liberation. But it's kind of, this challenge has been revived in application to the concept of dignity. So Will Kimlicker's article in Canadian Journal of Philosophy on human rights without human supremacism is a good example where he really attacks contemporary dignitarian thinkers for their exclusion of non-human animals. I've also argued in a separate paper that attempting to justify human dignity is doomed to fail, that there is no good justification for restricting the scope of dignity to humans alone. And a bunch of other thinkers have made similar points, explaining the sense in which dignity is exclusionary towards non-human animals. And some people even argue that it's the whole purpose of dignity as a concept is to exclude non-human animals and demarcate that line between the human and the animal. And the question this gives rise to is, what do we do about it? And I think there's two kind of obvious solutions. The first one is to accept and defend the human supremacism inherent to human dignity. So there's a few thinkers that argue for this, and they argue that we ought to pursue this because it's the best way to protect vulnerable humans. The second option is to reject dignity wholesale and adopt an alternative, more inclusive theory. So Kimlicka defends this kind of approach. He thinks that we should just focus on sentient rights. But I think there's a third option, and that option is to revise dignity so that it's more inclusive. So Pablo Gilabert has attempted this already in an article called Inclusive Dignity, where he argues that rather than just grounding dignity in rationality or moral personhood or merely the fact of being human, we ought to extend the range or number of capacities at the basis. So we end up with what I call a pluralist account of dignity, where there's several properties at the basis. And so he develops this in two of his books that he has out with OUP. I think there's many merits to that approach. So I think that Gilabert gets a lot right with his understanding of dignity and the way it kind of operates. But I do think that we need to revise it by instead basing dignity on a single, more inclusive property, the property of sentience. Okay, so that's the challenge of exclusion. So what I'll do now is talk a little bit about what sentience is, and then move on to discussing the three virtues that I see an account of dignity based on sentience alone would have. So the way I'm understanding sentience differs slightly from the way that Jeremy Bentham, for instance, understands it. So I don't see sentience as this property that is merely just about pleasure and pain. Instead, I think we ought to understand sentience as a property that captures the sense in which we have subjective experiences of a range of different evaluative phenomena. And we ought not to reduce all of those phenomena just to pleasure and pain. So we can experience contentment, boredom, joy, grief, all of these different range of emotions that ought not to just be categorized as pleasure and pain. And I think the same is likely true of other animals. So it's a much more capacious understanding of sentience. And several other people, it's not just me that defend this kind of understanding. There's quite a few other thinkers that adopt this. And the second thing to say about that is that it's becoming increasingly obvious that, according to the scientific literature, that quite a large number of animals have this capacity for consciousness, this capacity for sentience, for subjective experiences. So this is part of the reason why I think it is a stable basis. So first virtue then kind of concerns the scope that I think adopting an account of sentient dignity would give us. So the idea here is that it's neither over-inclusive nor under-inclusive. So it's kind of, when thinking about a basis for some status of some kind, we need a property that sufficiently responds to the challenge of exclusion without extending the scope too far. And so I think this is one of the problems with Pablo Gilabert's account, for instance. I think that by adopting a pluralist view, he ends up by extending the scope of dignity too far. So one example is, so he thinks, for instance, that rationality alone would ground dignity. But that opens up the possibility that there might be some beings out there that have a capacity for rationality, but no capacity for sentience. And he expresses some doubt that this kind of thing would be possible. So I don't want to say here that Gilbert is like pinning himself to the mast of this pluralist account. I think that he is sympathetic to the idea that some kind of subjective experience might be a necessary basis in some way. But I think the problem with this, if we were to adopt this kind of pluralist view, is that it doesn't seem apt to include these kinds of beings because it's not clear that we can violate their rights. So if you think, for instance, of Hal from 2001: A Space Odyssey, it's not clear to me that Hal has the kind of abilities in mind, the capacities that mean that we can violate his rights. Again, I think there's a few objections that could be raised here that I consider in the paper. But if you're intrigued by those, then we can definitely discuss them in the Q&A. So another example is the case of plants. So Gilbert also claims that cooperation might be another property at the basis for dignity, that if you have that property, then you end up with dignity too. But again, it looks like plants, for instance, can cooperate using mycorrhizal fungal networks. So that's what's depicted in the diagram there. And so this looks like a kind of cooperation that means that we would then want to say that they have dignity. But it doesn't look to me like it would, again, be apt to say that they have dignity. In both cases, I think it is plausible to say that these entities might have some kind of value. So we might be able to, I don't know, harm them or undermine their value in some way with the way we treat them. But what I want to say is that that's different from treating them with dignity. So that's the claim. Another thing about the scope is that it's becoming, another reason why I think this is a good scope to adopt is that the public is becoming increasingly aware of the sentience of other animals. So the diagram here is from a pilot study done by the BCSPCA in Canada. And it's outlining the number of people, the percentage of people within this study that perceive the animals depicted as having the capacity for sentience. So I think this is another reason why it forms a good basis, is that more and more people are understanding what sentience is and the extent to which animals possess it. And I also think that it has a good ability to deal with these kind of questions of uncertainty that lie at the margins. So I won't say too much about this other than referencing some work that is being done in philosophy in this area, including by the people listed as well as Jonathan Birch. So that's the first virtue. I think it deals very well with these challenges of scope. The second virtue concerns complexity. So I think that when we have an account of dignity, it needs to be able to tell us in some way how to weigh up different capacities at the basis, to tell us what kind of interests of a particular person we ought to prioritize. So imagine, for instance, that you are tasked with helping somebody, and you must now decide whether or not to prioritize their capacity for agency to make their own choices versus their interest in having a healthy life. And it looks like there you ought to necessarily, not necessarily, but at least some of the time, at a certain point, give priority to their agency. And the reason for that is because it's going to undermine their other interests in some way. So even if they want to smoke, you ought to allow them to smoke, even if this is bad for their health. And so an account of dignity ought to be able to manage this kind of complexity. And my claim is that if we end up with a pluralist account with several properties at the basis, then it's not clear how we ought to make these kinds of assessments. And so you might be wondering, well, how does sentience fare any better? Isn't it just going to favor the kind of welfarist kind of solution? And I don't think that's true, because the idea is that sentience is the basis that then determines the value of the other capacities, because those capacities are of value to us because we're sentient beings. So you can think of sentience as kind of the scale that we're using to weigh the importance and value of those capacities against one another, rather than having this kind of several properties at the basis that make it difficult to work out which one should take priority. And so I outline this a bit further, this kind of approach a bit further in a different article in the Journal of Ethics. And I think it's a good approach, partly because it is a bit more parsimonious than these more pluralist accounts. So another kind of question that might be on your mind here is how does this work when it comes to the kind of very different experiences that, say, a bat has from a human? So how do we know that their sentience is the same exactly? Why can we use that to weigh it in the same way? And I think the response to that is that what we don't need is that everybody has this exact same subjective experiences of sentience. Instead, the claim is that our sentience is structured in the same way, that we have the similar kinds of sentient experiences. So we all see things and react to them, or perceive things and react to them, I should say, because not every being is seeing things as such. So a couple of references there that make this point quite well and help to explain why it can manage this kind of complexity. So that's the second virtue. And the third virtue concerns moral distinctions. So I've got a diagram here that I hope is gonna help explain what I mean here well. So my worry is that if we endorse this kind of more pluralist approach that is not just grounded in sentience alone, then we might end up with more inclusive account, but we'll also end up with distinctions within dignity between beings that have one property and beings that have two of the properties and beings that have three. And you can see it could become even more complicated as we add properties into the mix. So take, for instance, normally, or traditionally, I should say, dignity was grounded in the capacity for some kind of complex rationality of some kind. And that's good because we end up including typical adult humans. So a kind of pluralist approach might say that to include some humans and many animals that are outside the scope of complex rationality, let's add sentience into the mix. And then we've got them included as well. But my concern is that we do include them, but we still have this line dividing bearers of complex rationality versus bearers of just sentience alone. So we still have problematic moral distinctions, and it looks like we have ranks of dignity, which seems to undermine this kind of sense of commonality that I'll speak to a little bit later that I think dignity captures. And the more capacities we add to the mix, the more complicated this gets, I think. So we end up with more distinctions, as I mentioned. So a few examples there. My claim, effectively, though, is that if we take those properties away, focus on sentience alone, then we not only simplify things, but we remove these potentially problematic distinctions. One caveat, of course, is that there is still one distinction, and that's between bearers of dignity and non-bearers of dignity. So I've kind of already mentioned something towards this when I discussed the virtue of scope. So obviously, focusing on sentience is likely to exclude certain organic entities like plants, which look like they might have a capacity for cooperation, but not necessarily a capacity for sentience. But as I mentioned, I'm not claiming here that I don't think organic entities have no value. I do think they're likely to have moral value. What I'm claiming is that it's just not apt to talk about that value in terms of dignity. Okay, so those are the three virtues. So I'll leave it there for the defense of sentience as the basis, though I'm sure you've got many questions about the success of that. The next thing to focus on is this question of why dignity. So this is sometimes put as some kind of redundancy challenge. And I think there's two possible versions of this challenge. The first version kind of focuses on a generalized skepticism about the usefulness and uniqueness of dignity. So whether it applies to humans or animals, this kind of challenge applies to accounts of human dignity as well as this account of sentient dignity or other accounts of animal dignity out there. And the idea is that if dignity lacks some useful and unique function, then we should just focus on sentient rights or human rights or whatever else instead, so we can just dispense with it. The second version of the challenge instead says, okay, even if human dignity might be defendable, animal dignity might not. So the idea here is that there's a specific skepticism about the usefulness of dignity in the context of animal rights. And a question here might be, is the entire purpose of dignity to implement that strict demarcation between humans and other animals, as I mentioned near the start? And so I think this in particular, in the context of animal rights and animal rights law, can be concerning because you might worry that defending some account of animal dignity could actually undermine advances in animal rights in some way. If we've still got this idea of dignity that involves this demarcation, then it looks like we're still carving up the legal landscape in some way. So those are the two challenges. And in my view, the account of sentient dignity that I'm proposing can respond to both of them. So as mentioned, I'm going to say two things to that. One will focus on the kind of philosophical value, the unique account of dignity, the uniqueness of that account. And the other is going to focus on the kind of strategic value, the ways in which it can buttress law and politics. So I'll start with the philosophical value, but I'm going to keep this relatively brief, given that this is a talk in a law series rather than a philosophy series. So the first claim, so I've got three claims I want to make here. The first is that sentient dignity is a unique status, and I think that it's maintaining the five key features of the idea of dignity that is drawn from neo-Kantianism. So I won't give a deep overview of what those features are, but the idea is effectively that there's this unique status in place, and that status is not one that depends on any social circumstances. It prohibits instrumentalization. It's a kind of status that each person possesses in the same way, so it's not about ranking in any way. And it's got this sense of inherent value. So I think there's arguments that can be made for each of these points, but the idea is that we could have an account of sentient rights that has some of these features, but if it's having all of these features, then it looks like it's already an account of sentient dignity. So sentient dignity is maintaining each of these features as a unique status. The second claim is that I think that having an account of dignity at all and an account of sentient dignity is a holistic approach to approaching this topic. So it involves bringing in a network of different concepts that we can rely on, including those listed, but also ones that concern the kind of social status that we have, the ways that people ought to treat us with respect, and etc. So I draw this point from Pablo Gilibert, who calls this some dignitarian network, and he relates all the different concepts in that network. So I do recommend looking to his work if you're interested by that idea. And then the third and final point is that the proposal for sentient dignity is what Pablo Gilibert, well, Gilibert calls dignity in general, and he always uses the language of human dignity. He calls it a deliberative interpretive proposal. But my claim is that sentient dignity is also a deliberative interpretive proposal. So what does that mean exactly? What it means is that we are taking dignity as it's kind of understood in the human rights debate as human dignity, and we're interpreting the meaning of it, but we're also prescribing some revisionary recommendations for how that meaning should be reshaped in certain ways. And so obviously one of the key ways in which it's being reshaped in the account that I'm providing is we're dispensing with the human focus and saying, well, no, this applies to all humans and all animals that have sentience. So that's the sense in which it's a deliberative interpretive proposal. So that's a philosophical value that I see it to have. So the strategic value instead, there's a couple of points to be made here. But the first is that I think that the idea of sentient dignity usefully draws on the way that our moral psychology works and the way that we see others as members of our shared group in some way. So arguments towards this point have been made in the case of the human. So the idea is that in humanism, by drawing on this sense that we are all humans, we help to combat oppression in some way. So rather than distinguishing people up based on smaller groups like race and sex and ethnicity or nationality, we say we're all part of the same family. We're all in the same tribe, so to speak. My problem or my worry with accounts that focus on animalness or animal kind is that that is a separate category that still maintains this human-animal distinction. My claim is that focusing on sentient kind instead, or sentience as some kind of basis for dignity, instead brings everyone into the same family. So the idea is that we're now talking about humans and animals as having this like shared property that we're all of the same tribe. We're in this together. And so one question here might be, well, why is dignity doing this? And the reason I think that dignity is doing this is because it's often used as this concept that is drawn on to say, well, there's something we share. There's this common basis. So they ought at least be treated with dignity. That is something that is often claimed. So the idea is that by defending sentient dignity, we directly go against this kind of demarcation between the human and the animal. And so there's a bunch of literature in psychology that defends this idea that tribalism is quite innate, that we form in and out groups. And a lot of this is now being applied to the idea of the human and the animal. And some of it also has been taken up by philosophers discussing and critiquing humanism and speciesism in general. So I think all of that helps to buttress this idea that sentient dignity might help combat this tribalistic tendency. So the idea then is that what sentient dignity is giving us is a more unified rights law. So I think that Swiss law is perhaps a good case here. So I'm not a legal theorist, so this is where you can take me to town in criticizing my understanding of Swiss law. But my understanding, at least, is that as Swiss law defends animal dignity alongside this concept of human dignity as well, what it's doing is still maintaining this distinction between the human and the animal. And one of the ways that you can see that is that human dignity is not seen as something that can be instrumentalized. But the concept of animal dignity looks like it often involves this like caveat that it's still okay to instrumentalize animals in some way. So that's my worry when we focus on specifically animality. Yeah, it's demonstrating that there's one notion for humans and one notion for animals. And so the claim is that to work towards greater justice for animals, we really need to get them in the club. We really need to think of ourselves as in the same club. And we need rights laws, principles for politics, for public policy, and also for everyday ethical life that are built on the same basis, on this idea of sentient dignity and together with it, sentient rights for us and for other animals. So that's my claim. So just as how am I doing for time, Eva? Good. Okay. So just as a way of conclusion, I'll just say something to summarize what I've just said, and then I'll say a bit more, as promised, about how I see this working as some kind of wider foundation for multi-species justice. So my claim is focusing on the left side of the diagram on the screen. So the claim is that sentience is what gets you in the club for having this status of dignity, and then you end up with inherent value because of this basis in sentience, and this grants you sentient rights and respect. And I outlined three virtues that I think this approach has. I think it's produces a nice scope and it helps to deal with complexity and it also avoids these problematic moral distinctions. So the next question is kind of, well, what about the right side of the picture? Should we just reject those kinds of understandings, those kinds of views? Very often, these two approaches are kind of pitted together as if they're rivals. That if you endorse one, you can't endorse the other. My claim, or the claim that I'm exploring, is that we can actually get a conventionalist understanding of dignity, or we can get many of the claims that conventionalists want to make from a naturalistic understanding of dignity. And we actually end up with a more robust understanding of those claims if we do that. So I'll just say a little bit now about why I think that is and why I think that forms a broader foundation. So I'll go over each of these just briefly. So the first idea is that if we have this concept of sentient dignity, then that's forming us a basis to say that we ought to perceive other animals as having an inherent value. We ought to treat them in these ways that recognize their status as bearers of sentient dignity. But this is not in fact the case. So when we look at the current landscape, animals are primarily perceived as having a use value, and this is, as far as I understand it, how they're often treated within the law. And so what I want to call this is desubjectification. So they're frequently treated as if they don't have some kind of subjectivity, some kind of sentience. And the claim that I'm exploring is that this denies them their sentient dignity. So there you see, we've got this account of how sentient dignity is being denied within a broader social practice, within the social community, based on the way that they're perceived by us humans. And then the second claim focuses on this idea of rank and social status, or the second idea that I want to explore. And the idea here is that if dignity is this natural kind of status that we possess, then I think there's something to this idea that it means that we ought to have this kind of high status where we can hold ourselves up and present ourselves as almost equals to others. Well, not almost as equals to others. And when we look at the current social landscape, we see that animals, in fact, have an inferior social status, that they're not treated as having equality with other humans. And equality might be a tall order, but not inferiority, I don't think, is necessarily a tall order. So that involves not treating them in ways that inferiorize them in some way. And the idea here is that having that inferior social status is harming them, even if indirectly in some way. So even if they're unaware of their social status within the group, their social status means that they lack access to certain social goods that are positional goods. So they can't. So animals kept as pets can't roam outside and explore in the same way that humans can because they've got this inferior social status that means their lives are controlled by humans, their human owners. So that's the second idea. And then the last idea is that by focusing on sentient dignity, we can adopt this framing for animal rights, or what I want to call sentient, and what others have called as well, sentient rights, that is in fact institutionally protected. And part of the reason for that, it relates to the things that I've mentioned. By bringing animals within our own club, we protect them on the same basis. And so the idea there is that we end up with conventions in place that help to defend animals in a broader sense. So those are the three ideas, or the three ideas I want to explore in future work. But yeah, so I'll stop there. Thanks so much for listening, and I'm really looking forward to your thoughts, feedback, and questions.